Sorry about that. We ran into the break. Uh, let's talk about Paul. And I
Yeah,
mentioned to you that the one show that we did about Paul was very negative, and it was the typical Jewish version of he was a traitor. He was
right,
uh, almost a non-Jew by the way he thought. He was
right.
everything that we don't want around, and it was so unfair because Gabriel Boccaccini, who's it's interesting. His dad is an Italian guy, and his mom is a Jew
Hmm.
from Tunisia or something like that, and so he knows what it's like battling between different families, and he's
Yeah,
saying that Hellenist Jews, they usually have a negative perspective from most people. They're like, oh, you're either a Hebraic Jew, one that follows the Torah faithfully, or you're a Hellenist Jew who's, hanging out with the Greeks and
right.
partying. They were the majority of the Jews up until the 7th century. So
Mm.
when we read texts that even now are considered mystical, people always go to Philo and they say, well, Philo was out there, but he was still Jewish enough because he never denied circumcision. He never denied
Right.
the importance of Torah. But that Paul guy, he just threw everything out. And then the other
Right.
version of that is making Paul a schizophrenic, or my friend Dominic Crossan and this other guy wrote a book called The First Paul, where they
Yeah.
actually say that there's three different Pauls, and they pick the Paul that agrees with them, and then they trash all the other Pauls. So they'll find where Paul says something very serious about the behavior of women in synagogue, or the kehilas of the Jewish
Right.
Christian back then, and they don't like that. So then they go to a different passage where he calls a woman an apostle, and they said that's the real Paul. The other Paul was crazy, and that was some guy that came later and had to backtrack the real Paul. So
Classic
how would you
academic move.
describe Paul without making it sound also that this is what Hebraic Christians and Messianic Jews do? They'll portray him as an Orthodox Jew, and then you have nowhere to go from there. And in my view, you can have a very
Yeah.
sophisticated, worldly, or very knowledgeable of Greek philosophy and Greek culture Jew who's also
Yeah.
very devout and religious. But they want
Yeah.
to make it you're either devout and religious, which means you want nothing to do with Greek thinking,
Right.
or you're so
Yeah.
far out that everything you're
Yeah.
saying is wacky. And that's it's almost like we have to reclaim Paul so he doesn't turn into whatever people want to turn into him, either the enemy of the Jews or the
Right. Right.
this
Right.
guy full of sophistry. Like he's trying to make everybody happy, and at the end, everybody hates him. So how would
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
portray him in
Right.
a fair way that makes more sense historically?
So I'll say I sometimes talk to my teenagers and I tell them, one of the things that they need to recognize is that their brains are expanding, they're learning concepts, but their concepts are abstractions. They don't know what those things actually mean yet. They're concepts. And so concepts lend to idealism and to pristine scenarios that, of course, won't work out in the real world. And so, I'm going to go do this with my life, and then I'm going to go to this school, and then I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to get married, and then I'm going to have this many kids, and then I'm going to retire when I'm 40. And they get the plan, but it's not actually been tested in the soil. And a lot of that's kind of the world of like looking at first century Judaism is we get a little bit of knowledge, and then but we have to resist the temptation to present these pristine pictures of a pristine Judaism and a Hellenistic Judaism, and they're all these neat, distinct categories. And when we do that, like, we can't ever find Paul, and we can't probably find Jesus either. And but in reality, it's complex. It's obviously generally we know Hellenistic upbringing because of his birth in Tarsus. That is fairly well known, and his education and the context for his education, of course, would have been extremely pagan. Because of his writing, that's generally why people attribute it. And there's only one context for learning to write as well as Paul did, and that was the gymnasium, the Greek gymnasium. And that would have been, full of idolatry. You had Greeks and Romans running around learning in the nude half the time. And it's just it's not Gamaliel in the synagogue like we imagined the whole time. And so it is hairy with Paul. And then one of the things that I think is helpful too is when you recognize that the diversity. So it was really later on that you and I have had lots of conversations about Daniel Boyarin, but I think one thing I think is good about that we can agree on is that there did seem to be an attempt to, and this happened especially in Maimonides, but it happened even earlier in the Talmud, where there's an attempt to kind of frame Judaism for the first time in terms of right belief. Like a good Jew is somebody that adheres to certain doctrines. And that was, I agree with him that was probably influenced by Christians. Because it's very difficult. You can say somebody's being a lousy Jew, but it's hard to say you're not really a Jew unless you believe certain things. And that trend kind of seemed, I agree with him that it kind of seemed to probably be influenced by Christian ideas. But that said, I don't know that they had that early on. And so that's why you have like a diversity of opinions in Second Temple literature. You have a diversity of, just think about the ideas that are communicated in Jubilees and how circulated the book of Jubilees was. And that's pretty different. And other literature that's very diverse. The author of Second Maccabees can't really agree with the story of